So as load shedding persists daily, fears of a complete national blackout continue to circulate. The issue was brought closer to home, with our neighbours, Botswana experiencing a complete outage on Monday. For more on this, we're joined by Professor of Physics at the University of Johannesburg, Hartmut Winkler. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. So what do we know about what happened with our neighbours?
Yes, well, Botswana only has one major power station that supplies more than 80% of its electricity. It's Morupule, coal-fired power station. And once it experienced an outage, it essentially meant that the whole country was desperately short of electricity. The only other few sources they have is some very minor power stations or what they can import from other countries, and that wasn't nearly enough. So that led to essentially the whole of Botswana blacking out then. And since then, they've been trying to get the units back on operational again. I was listening to a briefing that the local utility there was giving, and they've of the units that were down, they've managed to get approximately half of them back up, and they expect the majority to be up and running by this evening. But yes, it would have meant that they had to institute quite severe power restrictions. In fact, there's not many households that would have had much electricity. A lot of people were complaining that they didn't have electricity for 24 hours and so on. Oddly enough, it didn't seem to be a headline story there. I tried to track the local media and so on, and there wasn't anything about it, which initially made me wonder if the whole thing had been sorted out within a couple of hours, although clearly that wasn't the case. In comparison to South Africa, essentially what they experienced at that particular power station happens in South Africa almost on a daily basis. We always hear about unit so-and-so at power station so-and-so tripping. Now, every time that happens, that's more or less what happened in Botswana on the night leading to Monday. And so when that happens in South Africa, because we are such a much bigger system, essentially means a shortfall of roughly 1 gigawatt. So that's typically a situation where Eskom will say, well, we need to increase the load shedding by one stage. So it's not as catastrophic for us as it would have been for Botswana, where suddenly they just had almost no electricity left. So it would be, because we have so many different power stations and much larger ones as well, it just means that we are being squeezed a little bit more tightly.
It is not as catastrophic for us, for now at least, because Eskom announced that breakdowns are currently at 19,333 megawatts of generating capacity. And so what should we understand about that, especially when you take a look at winter, with some reports suggesting that we're sitting at almost half of our generating capacity out?
Yes, we are at the moment only operating on something like half of the capacity that should normally be available. And you're quite right. As we get closer to the middle of winter, here in Johannesburg, we just experienced our first cool day. And I'm sure that the use of heaters has gone up quite drastically since yesterday evening. So as a result, the demand also starts going up. As we get into July, which tends to be our coldest month, it's going to be a bit higher still. So it's clearly worrying that 19 gigawatts of power are out, with a further, I think, 4 gigawatts out for maintenance. Eskom normally tries to plan in such a way that when they have scheduled maintenance, that they don't have it during those months. So I expect that as we get towards the middle of winter, the scheduled maintenance is going to be lower. But we may then also have a situation, at least on some days, where the unscheduled breakdowns are higher. And certainly that would lead to a situation where we can expect higher stages of load shedding than we have now.
Prof, I appreciate that you did not get an opportunity to follow proceedings as they were happening in Parliament with the SIU, the Hawks and the police appearing before SCOPA. But something that the police minister said just now is that his understanding after a certain meeting, including the president, when the president came down hard on particular stakeholders responsible for different things around this issue, including ministers, he says his understanding after that meeting is that problems at Eskom remain technical and criminal. Some 2 billion rand has been spent on security internally with some 6,000 security individuals. I mean, as we hear this as a country, including the fact that none of the authorities have so far been able to get a hold of the the former CEO of Eskom, Andre Tereta, on this report that I must admit I have not seen. I'm not sure if you are privy to it. And so when you hear all of this, what goes on in your mind?
Yes, well, undoubtedly Eskom is experiencing huge technical problems, and these are problems which cannot just be fixed very quickly. It's not a case of just calling in the electrician and it's all done and dusted and working again in a short period of time. Some of these breakages they are having have been around for quite some time, and I expect the reason that they haven't been attended to is just simply that it requires the importation and purchase of extremely expensive equipment, so it needs to go through a number of processes, and then also the actual repair work is again something that is not just simple. We had the situation of Kusile Power Station, which lost half of its capacity towards the end of last year when they had this collapsed chimney. And that they're going to now try and repair. That's going to take them at least until the end of the year, probably more like another 6 months after that. And while that's all happening, that's over 2 stages of load shedding that we shouldn't be subjected to. Is criminality a problem at Eskom? No doubt about it. I'm sure there are a whole series of criminal gangs or just opportunists who are using the fact that there's weaknesses in the system, and that to what extent that is the main driver behind load shedding, I don't think it's an overwhelming reason for it, but it certainly contributes to it. So that plays into it, and the other problem is just simply that there's been bad planning in the electricity sector for the last, at least since 2015 or so. We need, the government needs to act according to a proper electricity plan. These plans, while they have been developed, they've tended to not be updated as often as they should be. They should be updated every 2 years. We're now currently sitting on one which is already 4 years old. And even as far as the implementation of what's in those plans, we are behind schedule. If one looks at what was supposed to happen over the last 3 or 4 years, things just haven't progressed nearly as fast as they should have. For example, the rollout of the solar and wind power plants are roughly 2 years behind schedule, simply because the process was started late.
Prof, before we let you go, we are made to understand that there's no such thing as a blackout. So South Africa will not go into a complete blackout. So will we see a complete grid collapse, or do you foresee a complete grid collapse?
Okay, to get a complete grid collapse means that you just don't load shed. In other words, you just let things develop and don't deliberately switch off certain users. Once the demand or the use electricity exceeds what you can actually produce, then you will end up with that kind of situation. Now, in Botswana, they were able to restart everything in 2 days. They have to go one by one, kick up the one power station, use the electricity from that to help start the other ones. If you do it in South Africa, it will take longer, simply because you have to literally start off somewhere and then gradually build up the system to the level it was. So in South Africa, to get everybody back to what it was, could take as long as 2 weeks rather than the 2 days that they've been having in Botswana.
Thank you very much to energy analyst and physicist at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Hartmut Winkler. Thank you, Prof.